Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. This evening, we will be talking about safety and security in the field, working with MSF in more than 70 different countries around the world. My name is Sally Thomas. I'm currently working here in the Australian office, and I started working with MSF back in 2009 and mainly work in the field as a logistician and a project coordinator. With me this evening, first of all, next to me, I have Mr. Adam Childs. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Sally.
Adam has over 17 years' experience in delivering humanitarian assistance in insecure and conflict zones. He has a Master of Science with distinction in Risk Crisis and Disaster Management, and is an adjunct senior lecturer with James Cook University. And previous to working in the humanitarian sector, he had a varied background in technical management, tax advisor, financial consultant and designer. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you again. Yeah.
And next to Adam we have Mr. David Nash. Welcome, David.
Good evening, Sally.
David, you as well, you started with MSF in 2009, the same year that I did. And before that, you were a farmer and a small business owner in Zambia and Australia, completing 10 field placements as a logistician, project coordinator and head of mission in various countries including Kenya, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Bangladesh, Ukraine, Tanzania and Somalia. Welcome tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, so tonight we will be discussing safety and security in the field, as I mentioned, and the four main strategies that MSF adopts on a daily basis in the field are deterrence, avoidance, protection and acceptance. So, Adam, firstly to you, could you describe for us what does MSF mean when we talk about deterrence in the field?
Deterrence in general means threatening harm to someone who might want to harm you, and obviously that isn't a good thing for a humanitarian organisation. So unlike the military, we don't threaten to shoot people or use guard dogs, but we will do things like say to people, look, if you harm us, we are going to report you to the authorities. In many countries we work in, there is a workable law and order, and it may even be other authorities such as the UN or someone else out there, but in many of the places we work, there also aren't those sorts of established formal methods. So what we will say is things such as, look, if you make it too difficult for us to work with you here in this country, we are going to have to withdraw. And by withdrawing, we're going to withdraw our aid. And that, in turn, will hurt the communities. And that's normally sufficient to get us some sort of protection.
Okay. And avoidance?
Avoidance, again, it's pretty hard for MSF who chooses to work in insecure contexts to avoid all risk, but that doesn't mean that we just run in and take any old risk. We, number one, make sure that the risks we are taking are in line with the benefits that we are providing. So we're not going to go in and just say, you know, I know it's a war zone, but I'd like to deliver this packet of biscuits. So, no. So, but once we're there, there's also other ways of avoiding risk, such as we may have a safe room in the house, which we can use for a few minutes, or we may use convoys. But generally speaking, it means the same sorts of things you'd use at home, locks on your doors, passwords on your computers, a wall around your house. In the field, it may be a bit taller wall than you'd have in Sydney or somewhere like that. But those are the protective measures that we take.
I was going to say, so that brings us into the protection and how that is one of our strategies in the field also. Yeah.
So we've got those deterrence, protection, and avoidance, and the deterrence are, the protection is a lot of the things that I just mentioned. But they often overlap. So you've got the avoidance where you are trying to stay away, and the protection then kicks in when you can't stay away.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest things of our protection is our identification, our T-shirt, and that I think leads us very nicely into acceptance.
The MSF symbol, which a lot of people around the world are very aware of. Yes, so David, we know that, those of us who work within MSF, acceptance and community acceptance is a massive part of safety and security in the field. Do you want to describe for our audience tonight a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, most places where MSF works, we are going to be either a major provider of healthcare or the sole provider of healthcare. And that is something which we can take for granted in Australia, but if you're in somewhere like South Sudan, it's not a small thing. It's something that is of great value to the community. So the whole community, when they see what we're doing, want us to be there, and they know that if we're not safe, we won't be there. So they want us to be there. We get acceptance. To make that stronger, we have make it very clear that we are neutral. We do not hide anything. We do not pick sides. We do not side with one side or the other. In South Sudan, for example, we had projects during the Civil War on both sides of the conflict. In Ukraine, the same. And we're very clear to the military and government authorities as well that we were neutral, that we were operating on both sides, and we had acceptance from the authorities as well as the members of the society as well. So this, to me, is a very large part of the security that we get, that people do not want to see us leave.
Okay, and so a lot of transparency about what we're doing, how we're doing it,
Absolute
and why
transparency, and of course the principle that when someone presents to an MSF facility, they're not one tribe, one religion, they're not even male or female, they are a patient. That's all. Even if they come wounded from a fight, they are a patient. And that principle, again, aids in our acceptance.
I think another part of acceptance, could we say, because MSF, when we're working in these countries, we are a guest in these countries.
Sure.
And so we need to always be very culturally sensitive. And how do you think some of that plays out in the field?
Yeah, it's very important that we recognise the local culture. It can be dress code, it can be what we eat and drink, or don't eat and don't drink. So we have to go with the local culture and remember that we are there not to make a statement about some cultural issue that we don't like. We're there to provide healthcare, and this is very important. And as I said, we can find ourselves in a position where we're providing the only healthcare for populations of hundreds of thousands of people, and that's very important. So we don't want to be culturally insensitive and risk that.
And if I may add, the good work that we do is very much part of that acceptance, but it's also part of the cultural sensitivity is talking to people and explaining why we are doing that specific sort of good work. Why are we focusing on women and children? Why are we focusing on that village and not that village? And this means that we really got to talk to everybody who's out there in the field. It's important that we get acceptance not just from our beneficiaries, because they like us because we do good work, but also for the people who aren't directly involved. So maybe that means going down and having a chat with the imam on a Wednesday afternoon, or playing football with the kids.
So you're constantly communicating and explaining our activities.
With everybody who's in that environment.
And using the community to pass messages as well.
I mean,
you mentioned the imam. A mosque is a vital tool. Sorry, I shouldn't put it that way, but using the imams at the mosque to spread the message of what we're doing, and to get children to come along for vaccinations and this kind of thing. It's very important. It's a two-way thing. Yeah.
Okay, so to all the listeners out there this evening, I'm sure a lot of you're listening tonight because you want to know what is our approach to safety and security in the field, because maybe you're thinking of applying to work overseas with MSF. Adam, you're one of our facilitators in our pre-departure training. What do you think are some of the myths, or what are some of the stories that people come to you, to those that have not worked in the field before, and maybe what their concept, what it is like in the field?
The first thing which becomes very clear is that people's estimation of risk is much higher than it actually is. In the last training, for example, we had people saying that the biggest risk they are likely to face will be getting kidnapped and then killed. when the reality is that there has been no aid worker, national or international, who's been kidnapped and killed in the last 2 years.
Okay.
So it's a very low risk, yet they come out and they really worry about these risks. The second one is that a lot of people know someone who are in the defence forces, whether it be New Zealand or Australia, and some of those people have said, MSF are cowboys, they don't know how to work in insecure zones. And we've been around for over 40 years. We're a $1.5 billion organisation, and we take safety and security very seriously.
And I guess our approach is very different.
Yeah, it's different from the military. So that's another one of the myths. And finally, I suppose one of the other myths is that we are right on the front line, because they hear us talking about helping people in need, those most in need, and working in insecure zones. Well, if you look at the news at night, and they're showing those horrendous images of war zones and things like that, you don't see any MSF T-shirts there. We're proximate. That doesn't mean right on the front line. We may be a kilometre back, we may be 10 kilometres back. So close to the patients, but not directly in the line of fire.
And David, you've been in a position, you've been a project coordinator and a head of mission in the field, so you're have been in a position of responsibility of implementing standard operating procedures in the field. Can you describe for us a bit more about what are some of these procedures that are in place that you implement in the field?
Right. Well, every time a project or a mission starts, there's a lot of work done on a risk matrix, which is identifying all of the things that could go wrong, from a war, kidnapping, or it could be dog bite, or any problem, snowstorm, anything that could go wrong. Snake bites, low-flying peacocks, yes. And then analysing what can be done to mitigate against those things happening, analysing what the impact would be if some of those things happen, and what to do if they do happen. And this is constantly revisited and updated. It ends up in a document normally of about 28 or 30 pages that spells out everything that will be done and who will be responsible for doing anything if anything goes wrong, if an evacuation is needed, for instance. And then that is communicated to every expatriate, should get a copy of that when they arrive in the field, along with a condensed version of 1 or 2 pages with the important bullet points of what they should and shouldn't do and behaviour.
Okay, so it's made very clear to everybody.
Clear to everyone.
And I guess sometimes, the context might change or shift. So it's continuously analysed, continuously communicated at all levels. Yeah.
And there's the head of mission and the project coordinator who are responsible for making sure that everyone knows what they should do.
They've got the ultimate responsibility. But would we say that it's everyone's responsibility?
Yeah.
But there is still that ultimate responsibility. So, Adam, you are one of our facilitators for our training module for pre-departure training. So all field workers, before you go and complete your first field placement, you conduct some safety and security training. Can you outline for the audience tonight what are some of the topics that you cover during that training?
Sure. One of them is exactly what David was just talking about, was that risk matrix. So we take people through the identification of risks in a case study, and then how to prioritize them, which ones should we be working on first, and then we present some strategies on how they can mitigate risks in general.
Yeah.
We also take them through some very specific standard operating procedures, such as if you go out with MSF, you will be wearing a seatbelt. It's just standard. But the focus is very much on not being prescriptive, but in providing tools and critical thinking and analysis, because every context is so different. It's more important that people learn what they can do, what they can't do, and give them some tools to help them through that. Now, it's a lot of training. It's spread out over 2 days, so we also need to keep it interesting and engaging. So we use a whole variety of training methods. There's even one section which is a quiz, which everyone quite likes, but at the same time it's a good way to find out, well, what knowledge do they already have and what should I perhaps emphasize a little bit more. It's important that we cover some pretty heavy topics that people may not have thought about, but at the same time not to scare them while they're in the classroom. So we do have a lot of fun, but it's a lot of training, and it's important that we do that.
And David, you've been in a position of then seeing brand new field workers, for the first time coming to the field. What do you usually do then when they arrive in the field to ensure that they are comfortable and confident and able to do their work, which is what they're there for?
Right. Well, they normally, always find there's a lot of camaraderie with other MSF workers, international and national. So there's a lot of support given to each other. And I always give a briefing to everyone when they arrive and remind them that they are in a place that is new to them. Usually it is a new place to them. I always say that I've lived in Sydney now for 30 years, and there are parts of Sydney I would be very careful about going to after dark on a Saturday night. But I feel safe here in Sydney because I know where they are. But anyone coming here, okay, Sydney's fairly safe. But another example, maybe I lived on a farm, and I know damn well that you don't put your hand under a log because there are redbacks there. Somebody coming there won't understand that.
Yeah.
When you come to a new place, you do not know the street rules. It takes time.
Yeah.
So I tell everyone, be careful, be very conservative. Take responsibility for your own safety and the way you act, and just be careful in those early days.
Yeah. Proceeding with caution. And tonight's topic, we're talking about safety and security. Adam, do you want to differentiate for the audience tonight?
Yeah,
what do we consider
safety are normally environmental dangers and hazards. So these are things which there is no motive to hurt. There is no targeting of individuals. You just happen to be there. So a flood, an earthquake, a mosquito bite, those are safety issues. And because they are not motivated, they're actually easier to mitigate because you need to come up with just one way to keep yourself safe against it, and it always works that way. So, for example, if you're worried about malaria, use insecticide impregnated bed nets, long sleeves, those sorts of things.
Yep.
Security, however, is normally man-made and deliberate. So shooting, laying of a landmine, those sorts of activities are caused by an individual. And any time that you mitigate that, those individuals, if they still want to hurt you, change their approach. So, and that is why, as David said, it's constantly updated.
Yeah.
That we are constantly assessing not only the likelihood, but how they're doing it and address it.
Yeah.
And our neutrality means that we are probably one of the unlikeliest targets in many of the contexts where we work.
Which then again, as that comes around to community acceptance and acceptance in the country.
And just to build on what David just said a little bit earlier about living in Sydney, when the first missioner arrives there, they're going to be surrounded by a lot of experience, not only experienced expats, but national staff who've got those streets smart.
Yeah.
So when you go out there, use that.
Yeah.
And that helps you get through those initial months.
Yeah. And talking about safety, I mean, one big example of that would, us being a medical organisation, you both worked in Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the, pre, during and post during a massive, intervention like that? How would we look at the safety in such an instance?
You were there longer than me, David.
Okay, well, one of the, there are a few sort of things that we practices that we put in place, like no touching. So it's a bit strange maybe to go for a couple of months without touching another human being.
And this is for everyone, patients,
this is for everyone,
national staff,
everyone, and it's something that we really made very strong and try to get through to the community as well. Ebola is not passed in the air. It's passed by touching another person and passing fluids. So no touch. And it's a bit kind of weird, not so much as shaking hands for 2 months. As soon as we came out, landed in Casablanca, about half a dozen of us, first thing we did was have a group hug because we could. It was the first time we'd touched another human being. And things like no shaving because of the risk of a cut that fluids could get through. So the first thing all the men wanted to do was shave their beards off, except me, and all the ladies wanted to shave their legs.
Yeah.
You know, silly things like this.
Yeah,
but,
basic everyday, normal things for us.
And every time you go through a door, there seemed to be a big chlorine container there. Wash your hands very carefully. Go in and out of a building. It was your feet as well. Taking your temperature every, I forget how many hours, I think it was about 3 or 4 times a day. And if you have a fever, report that, and you were quarantined until we knew exactly what it was that you had. So there were a lot of,
So during. And what about pre? Did you have much training before you went to Sierra Leone?
Everyone was trained on the use of the personal protection equipment, whether medical or not. Obviously, for the medical people, this was vitally important. And when they were working, it wasn't just what to do when they were wearing it, it was how to put it on, and more importantly, how to take it off, and how to work together when somebody was taking it. Well, when they're putting it on, they put it on together with someone else so that they could check each other. And when they were taking it off, they did it every time, even if they'd done it 50 times, under the instructions of another member of staff who would tell them when to take one sleeve down, the other sleeve down, how to wash and everything else. It was taken very seriously.
Yeah. And then post, so when you left Sierra Leone, what were some of the policies that were in place that helped you to, as you said, you hadn't touched anyone for 2 months, or helped you to reintegrate back here in Australia?
Well, whenever we come back from a mission, we get a lot of peer support from other returnees and the staff here at MSF Australia. Medically, there's the 3 months continuation of health insurance, and there's the option to visit a psychologist if you feel you need it, perfectly anonymously. I think I mentioned that the culture shock thing can get people.
Yeah.
And it's when
people
you come
often
back,
say it's harder when you come back than when you're going on mission.
With the Ebola, it was particularly, a particular instance because there was so much in the press here and other countries about how all the volunteers were coming back. They were a threat to society and life on Earth as we knew it. We're all going to die because of volunteers coming back. We're all going to have Ebola, which of course didn't happen. So there was this kind of...
So that's a very psychological impact to be dealing with every day.
Yeah. But some of that was quite funny. I mean, I think everybody who came back probably had the same experience as I did at the airport, face to face with one person who was wearing normal civilian clothes, filling in forms, and then a guy coming in at the back door in PPE to take your temperature at arm's length and then going out again. You think, well, what about this girl? But so there was some sort of comic relief and things like that.
I think it's important to point out that Ebola is a very specific context, and yet the theory behind it of having that pre, during, and post security protocol and personal protection is in every single mission.
Every mission.
And of course, we are a medical organisation, so the standard medical safety procedures such as sharp boxes, gloves, face masks, they're in all of our projects as well. But just an interesting aside, David and I worked together in Sierra Leone, and we met just before we did this webinar. It's the first time we've shaken hands, because even though we worked in the same country, David, do it again.
Do it again. There we go.
Okay.
We'd have both been sent home for that.
Yes, we would have been. Yeah.
And lastly, I'd like to touch on, so MSF, we are a medical humanitarian organisation. The roots of us being able to continue our work globally is through the aspect of volunteering for international and national staff all around the world. Adam, can you describe for us, how does this come into play when we talk about safety and security?
Well, the first thing is that even though we have people who are responsible in the line for managing security, the actual acceptance of a risk is an individual one. So each and every single person who works with MSF has to accept the risk or not. And if they find it too dangerous or they're just not up to it today, they've had a sleepless night or whatever, they can say no. They say, you know what, today I'm not ready to take that risk. Of course, in the military, that would be desertion, and you could get shot in the old days. So that's one big distinction between us. But it is that aspect of some sort of personal responsibility and involvement, which again we try to instill during the training to make sure that people know I need to be informed. I need to have read at least the 2 pages of the risk matrix, and I have the right to say no if I don't want to.
Yeah.
And that applies on both the national and the international side as well.
I'm talking about informed consent, and this, I think, follows on to, yes, we've had evacuations in the past. Sometimes we have partial evacuation or full evacuation. David, you've been in a position as a head of mission where you've made the decision to evacuate teams. Can you outline that for a bit more detail for our audiences tonight, and how does that play out in the field?
Yeah. Well, there's a strict line of how the decisions are made. You said on an individual basis. If someone is not happy where they are because of security, then they can leave, and no one can stop that. PC, head of mission, their job is to facilitate that leaving. If in a project, the project coordinator decides that the security is deteriorating and wants to evacuate, then that is his or her decision, and the head of mission or the headquarters cannot negate that. They have to follow that. On the other hand, if the project coordinator says, I think it's safe here, and the head of mission or someone higher says, no, we disagree, then it's evacuate.
They still have to come.
So it's always taking the safest route. And I've seen that in that latter in South Sudan, where a project was in a safe area, and the project felt happy to stay. The whole team felt happy to stay. But as the head of mission, I had to tell them, no, you're cutting down from 20 to 8 because that is the minimum that I can get out of there in a couple of hours' notice.
Right.
So everyone else is
preparedness
out,
for
just in case.
Just in case. Yeah. And just before this webinar, we were talking about an instance. I mean, us as a medical organisation, you were telling me an example of when a team did pull out, but what happens to the medical activities that are on the ground? What's the impact of that?
Well, the impact can be, if it is a complete evacuation and closing of a project, then it can be huge. But that is something that we only do in the direst of circumstances. Yep. It's rare. Yep. More often, I've seen instances where we've pulled out temporarily. An example in South Sudan again, where a member of the team was threatened by a member of the local community, and the project coordinator felt that it could escalate and get worse. So the whole team was pulled out, went back 2 days later after meetings with the community leadership, who again gave us guarantees that they would look after our security. Right. So these things tend to happen.
Yeah. And I guess just touching on that, and I think it sort of crosses over with maybe some of the myths. I think maybe people have watched too many American films, but do we pull out what about all the national staff, and how is, because as we know, national staff and the national staff, yes, we all work together, but my home is in Australia, but the national staff, that's their home. So we don't evacuate the national staff.
No,
do we?
the basic principle is that if you have been moved by MSF to be able to help, so someone has come from Australia and went to Nepal for an earthquake, then if we need to evacuate, we'll take you back to where you started from.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when we're talking about evacuation and pulling a team out, a lot of the local staff are local and they're not going to pull out. So we will support them as best as possible to continue the work for the patients, etc., during a short period of time while the strangers, who are perhaps at more risk, have been pulled out. So it's back to where you started from with MSF.
But often we find, the national staff, they don't want to leave, do they?
No.
They want to stay.
No. I've had one instance where we considered closing a project because we saw it as being impossible to return with international and national staff from outside of the area. I won't go into the details, but we considered closing the project, and we told the national staff who were there on site, and they said, well, look, we're not going anywhere. This is our home. We're staying. So please, can we keep the project open? Keep up with the support for us, and we will run the project, which is what we did.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I think that's a lovely note to finish on. So thank you both for joining us tonight and sharing some of your very lovely stories from the field. Very informative. Thank you very much. So thank you everyone for listening tonight. This is our last webinar for the year. We will be back next year with more topics, and we look forward to seeing you next year. So thank you and good night.